Hello, everyone. It is 1 o'clock Eastern Time, so we're going to get started. Welcome. My name is Larissa Klebe. I'm the Associate Director of Programs and Education at the Jewish Women's Archive. I want to welcome everyone to Rethinking the History of American Jewish Women, a conversation between Pamela Nadell and Judith Rosenbaum. Professor Pamela S. Nadell holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program and received the university's highest faculty award, the Scholar Teacher of the Year. A member of the founding historians team for Philadelphia's National Museum of American Jewish History, she is the immediate past president of the Association for Jewish Studies and was recognized by the American Jewish Historical Society with its Lee Max Friedman Award for Distinguished Service for the Field. Her books include Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889 to 1985, which was a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award. Her new book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, was published by W. W. Norton in March 2019 during Women's History Month. Dr. Judith Rosenbaum is a feminist historian and executive director of the Jewish Women's Archive. For anyone unfamiliar with the Jewish Women's Archive, or JWA for short, we are a national nonprofit dedicated to making known the stories, struggles, and achievements of Jewish women. You can learn more on our website, which is simply jwa.org. So before we jump into our program, I'll just briefly go over the agenda. Professor Nadell is going to talk about the book for the first 15 to 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a conversation between Professor Nadell and Dr. Rosenbaum for about 15 to 20 minutes-ish, and then the remaining time will be used for questions. So when we open up the floor for questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box. You should see an option for your chat box somewhere either at the top or bottom of your screen. So as we go along, definitely note questions you want to ask, and when the time comes, you can type them into that chat box. We'll answer as many questions as we can in the time that we have. Finally, just to answer everyone's question, yes, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available after the program today. So I am going to now go ahead and hand things over to Pamela Nadell.
Hi, thank you. First of all, thank you so much to the Jewish Women's Archive for inviting me to be here today. It's very,
Pamela, I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
I turned off it says mute is turned off.
I can hear her.
You can hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Yeah, Rivi says she can hear me. So I'm not, I'm not sure what was going on there, but should I continue?
Yes, I think so. If others can hear you, I can hear you. Jenny says she can hear you.
All right, thanks. So I'm very grateful to be here today with the Jewish Women's Archive, and very excited to be talking about this brand new book. I'm going to start by doing something a little bit daring. I'm going to show you a couple of family photos, which is not usually what one would do in an academic talk, but I want to start with a slide of my great-grandmother, and she's wearing a sheitel, and Larissa's going to try and get that over in a second. And this is a photo that I have that hangs on the wall of my dining room, and it's very old. It's from the early 1900s, and she's wearing a black brocaded dress, and she's as old-fashioned as could be in the early 1900s. And then the next slide, the next image, which hopefully we'll get to see in a minute, shows her daughter, my grandmother, and she's wearing a white lace and a cotton dress. She has a big bow in her hair. She's got bows on her shoes, and she's very she for her moment in time. I'm assuming the image was taken at around the same time. And then there's another image of my mother in a park on a warm spring day, and she has a white blouse on and a black pencil skirt, and over her shoulder you can see a baby's bonnet peeking out, and that baby's bonnet's me. And then if you move down the generations a little further, I'm wearing what you can see on screen now. I've got a black jacket on, my professional woman's wardrobe. And if I go to, oh, now you can see my, my great-grandmother. And then, and maybe we can see my grandmother will come up next. And then if I go back to my computer, I didn't bring a picture of this, but there's an image of my daughter, college student, sliding across my computer screen, and she's wearing skinny jeans and tall boots. And the reason I start with images of my family is because over the years, as I looked at those images, I kept thinking about how their clothing had changed, but it made me think about how their lives had also changed. My great-grandmother was one of more than 2 million East European Jewish immigrants who came to America. Her daughter, my grandmother, raised her children in the midst of the Great Depression. My mother, who came of age in the late 1940s, was a secretary, as was quite typical of women of her day and age. She got married, she stopped to raise her children, and then she went back to work and carved out a career as a realtor. I was the first person in my family to graduate college, and I rode the coattails of a revolution that opened up all sorts of new possibilities for American women. And my daughter, who is coming of age now, I don't know what kinds of opportunities the future will hold for her. But it's the photos that inspired my story. Yes, I'm a historian, of course, and I've written lots of history over the years, but looking at how their clothing changed, I wanted to know how their lives had changed. What was different about the families they raised, where they raised them, the kinds of work that they did, the politics they embraced, the games, even the games that women played. How had the great crises of wars, economic busts affected their lives? And also the technological marvels of each era, whether smartphones or the everyday or electric washing machines. I always try to think of what life was like before Jewish women actually had access to, or American women had access to washing machines. But most of all, what I wanted to know was what it meant to these women to be Jewish women. For these women were not only American women, they were America's Jewish women, simultaneously a part of American women and yet standing apart from them. That these women were Jews mattered deeply. For some, it shaped where they lived, who they knew, the kinds of work that they did, what they thought about politics, what they cooked in their kitchens. But of course, I know, and I bet those of you in the audience also know, being Jewish has varied enormously over time and varies enormously down until today. For example, some Jewish women in the past and in the present place Judaism at the center of their lives. Sabbaths, holidays, the community, the synagogue, the world around them, a world of Jewish organizations, world of Jewish causes, of Jewish rituals. That's the center of their very experience. Others don't center Judaism at the core of their lives, but for many others, what's centered is a sense of Jewishness. And I define Jewishness in my book as being the everyday experience of being a Jew. For some women, it defined where they lived, the kind of education they got, who they married, even what they cooked in their kitchens. For other Jewish women, being Jewish has been inconsequential, something that occasionally pops up now and then. It doesn't really make that big a difference in their lives. For other of America's Jewish women, being Jewish had no relevance at all. Yet sometimes they would still find out that they bumped up against the fact that they were Jews. There was a sampler at a museum exhibit a number of years ago. It said, if you think you can be a little bit Jewish, you think you can be a little bit pregnant. America's Jewish women cast its net over all of these. We meet the religiously observant and the fiercely secular in their homes and in colonial seaports. We see them in frontier towns. We visit them in urban ghettos and in post-war suburbs. We discover savvy businesswomen, feisty matrons, and the spirited women who became rabbis. We read in the book about weddings, rituals, marriages, babies, meals cooked, communities built, life in times of war and crisis, life in times of peace and prosperity. We meet those whose lives were most closely bound up with the quotidian of family, neighborhood, work, and community. But we also discover the many whose lives, spreading over larger canvases, left deep footprints in the history of this nation that they called home. What guides us into our story are the stories of two women, Grace Mendes Seixas Nathan, who lived her life bound by the commonplace roles of wife and mother. Grace Nathan was, on her father's side, descended from Portugal, a country that had forcibly converted its Jews in 1497. On her mother's side, she was the daughter of Rachel Levy, who was born in London to a German Jewish immigrant. And so her heritage blends both the Sephardic tale and the Ashkenazic tale of American Jewish history. But she was born into freedom on the American continent. The remarkable events of her life, the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the War of 1812, occasionally they pop up in her letters. She also wrote poetry, not published, of course. But when I read her letters, I read about a woman who was a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and then ultimately a great-grandmother. She was one of innumerable women, Jewish and Gentile, who centered their lives around home and family. But she had, we might get the next slide, a much more famous great-granddaughter, Emma Lazarus. Emma Lazarus left a legacy reverberating across American history. Emma Lazarus never married, she never bore a child, but she won fame for her writing, including extensive correspondence with famous figures of her day. And she remains acclaimed till this day for her poem, The New Colossus, in the base of the Statue of Liberty. Each of these women lived out their lives as women, as Jews, as Americans, but they were constrained by the social conventions of their particular time. Both celebrated the liberties of their American nation. Emma Lazarus actually sang of this great land that had granted her people the freedom to follow Moses's law. Nathan, in a kind of radical move, wrote to her son before her death in 1832. She wrote him an ethical will, and she said, "At my death, keep your beard only for 7 days." In Jewish tradition, men typically don't shave for at least 30 days after the death of a parent. Grace Nathan was making Jewish law. And I see them as setting the stage for this story of women who lived lives on smaller canvases, but had tremendous impact on those canvases of their families and their communities, and those women who lived their lives on much larger canvases, impacting American history. The overarching themes of America's Jewish women reveal them to be a part of American women, standing apart from them, as they displayed a powerful sense of identity and acted on commitments to improve the world for themselves and for others. Leaving behind Grace Nathan's life, and in the colonial period and the early Republic, and going beyond the date of Emma Lazarus's death, I turn to Rosa Sonnenschein, another Jewish wife, mother, and writer. When Rosa was in her early 20s, in the 1860s, she and her rabbi husband, Solomon Sonnenschein, left Prague and made their way to St. Louis. There, this well-educated Jewish woman, rabbi's wife, gave birth to the last of her 4 children, published articles in the Jewish press, and actually created the first Jewish women's book club in America that is still going strong today. In 1891, however, after a long unhappy marriage, she abandoned her husband, and she gave him grounds for divorce. This was the era when you couldn't get divorced. There was no such thing as no-fault divorce. You needed some kind of grounds in order to end a marriage. So leaving him, she gave him grounds to divorce her, but now she had to earn a living. And so she went to Chicago, and there she launched the first English language Jewish women's magazine in America and called it The American Jewess. And we might get to see 2 slides of that in a second. While the American Jewish extolled Jewish women as mothers in Israel, Sonnenschein was also touting in its pages women's equality in the synagogue and even championing Zionism, which was not a popular movement among American Jews then. Emma Lazarus and Rosa Sonnenschein are two women who used their pens to stand up for American Jewish women and their people. The American Jewess, which you can see on your screen, we can read that today online thanks to the wonderful work of the Jewish Women's Archive. It was also writing about the tens of thousands of Jewish women who began massing in the late 1890s to prove that women's sphere was the whole wide world. Beginning in the 1890s, moving down through the early 1920s, a host of nationwide Jewish women's organizations burst out: the National Council of Jewish Women, Hadassah, the Synagogue Sisterhoods. Why had they burst out now? Simply because there were massive physical changes in women's lives. In 1800, white American women had an average of 7 children. By 1900, they had an average of 3.5. In 1850, white American women's life expectancy was 40 years. By 1920, it had become 57 years. Women in America had more time where they weren't raising their children to devote to their communities. For hundreds of thousands of America's Jewish women, these organizations became their springboard to public service and activism for their people and all people at home and abroad. The National Council of Jewish Women, and I think we might have a slide, developed an international program to make certain that girls and women traveling to America on their own did not fall into the hands of white slavers. They then took their message to the White House, and you can see here how 100 years later they were honored in New York City. In 1913, in the next slide, we see 2 American Jewish nurses sail to Palestine, rented a house in Jerusalem, and hung out a sign that says American Daughters of Zion, Nurses Settlement Hadassah. In their first year, they treated 5,000 patients. Jewish women did not always need large national organizations to spur their activism. In the next slide, we see in New York on May 15th, 1902, immigrant Jewish housewives, furious at the soaring price of kosher meat, broke into butcher shops, grabbed the meat, threw it on the street, doused it with kerosene, and set it aflame. They were the first, but by no means the last, of the food and rent strikes Jewish women would stage across the decades to come. When American Jews launched a boycott of German goods in the 1930s, protest the Nazi treatment of their people, an angry shopkeeper in New York City on Madison Avenue called the police to stop the women from picketing his toy store at the height of the Christmas season. Meanwhile, in their homes, others were changing what it meant to be a Jewish woman in America. When the immigrant Kate Simon was growing up, her mother would polish the furniture on Fridays with lemon oil, and she would make gefilte fish. Then, like a good Jewish wife and mother, she would cover her hair and light the Sabbath candles. But one Sabbath Eve, to the astonishment of her family, she tore off her headcloth, blew out the candles, and announced, "I know more. I never believed it, and I don't have to do it to please my mother." She never lit candles again, according to her daughter, but Fridays and Friday evenings still smelled of lemon oil and gefilte fish in their house. Grace Nathan's mother was changing the way American Jews would live their Judaism, just as, Kate Simon's mother was changing the way American Jews would live their Judaism, just as Grace Nathan had. Our themes of activism and change converge into a rushing torrent when our story takes us into the decades after World War II. Even in the 1950s, not all Jewish women conformed to the narrative of the happy post-war suburban housewife pushing a baby carriage. America's Jewish women now included Holocaust survivors picking up the pieces of the past to make new lives. There were communists in America besides Ethel Rosenberg. And her execution with her husband, Julius, sent a Cold War chill across America's Jewish women who had embraced earlier leftist politics. After World War II, LGBT radical rouser Jerry Fayer left her husband and her children to come out in the subterranean lesbian culture of Greenwich Village. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, change appeared on the horizon. Female life expectancy increased. Once the pill came on the market, women had the most effective birth control womankind had ever known. The groundwork was laid for a new wave of feminism. When we look back at these years, the number of Jewish women in the forefront is astonishing. Betty Friedan coined the term the feminine mystique, naming the malaise of women who despaired there was nothing more to being a wife and mother. An Austrian Jewish refugee named Gerda Lerner campaigned for her adopted country to establish Women's History Month. The new wave of feminism wrought a revolution, as Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously quipped, "What's the difference between a bookkeeper and a synagogue and a Supreme Court justice? One generation." The feminism that changed Jewish women's lives in their families, communities, and workplaces spilled over to their synagogues and Jewish communities. Reformed Jewish women had called for women's ordination in 1963. Reformed Jewish men had then done nothing about it. During the Depression, the future Congresswoman Bella Abzug said Kaddish every morning at an Orthodox synagogue for a year after her father had died. But we only have to look about us today at the women who became rabbis, some even in the Orthodox world, to know the changes in Jewish communal life that have happened since then. I want to close with a story about another pair of letter writers. Some of you might remember when the Soviet Union refused to let the Jewish people go, Jewish boys and girls at their bar and bat mitzvahs would twin with a Soviet Jew who was denied his or her own coming of age ceremony. In 1982, a ninth grader from Miami Beach who liked to collect stationery wrote to her twin asking if her letters and the stationery she had sent as a Hanukkah gift had arrived. Today, the notion of needing paper to connect, of course, seems obsolete. Soviet twin Kira Volvosky lives in Jerusalem and is a web designer. Her American bat mitzvah twin might be better known to you. Her name is Sheryl Sandberg, COO of Facebook. It seems fitting to close this survey of 350 years of America's Jewish women's activism with another pair of letter writers whose words and deeds will reverberate across the generations to those who will write the next chapter in the history of America's Jewish women. And now I think Judith Rosenbaum and I are going to join in conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pam. That was really a wonderful introduction to the book. And I hope people will go out and read the rest of it because you did such a masterful job of packing 350 years into only about 250 pages and really bringing it to life by, as you just did in this talk, touching on the life stories of so many women and the specifics of their lives. We really get a sense of knowing some of them. And I was wondering if, as you were researching the book, there were particular favorite people that you encountered whose stories kind of came back to you, as you were putting the narrative together and thinking about whose voices you wanted to lift up and use to illustrate some of the trends in Jewish women's experience.
I always get that question. I always get asked, are there favorites? And you're a writer, so you know this. Of course, we always have favorites. One of mine is Carolyn Hamlin Spiegel, who was born as a Quaker in Ohio, and her family came to America in the 1600s, and she met a Jewish man named Marcus Siegel when he was peddling the byways of Ohio. And they married, and she converted to Judaism. And one of the great historical documents that we have is we have her conversion certificate. And we don't have her voice, we don't have her letters, but we have his letters. He enlisted in the Union Army, he became a colonel, and he wrote these astonishing letters. But when I read his letters, I could glimpse her voice. He would write things like, "I'm so sorry you're feeling blue," Well, that meant that she had written him and said to him, I'm feeling blue. So I teased out of his letters a place where the Jewish woman's voice would have been silent. And I love that I was able to include that story.
Yeah, I mean, that's so much of what is challenging about this kind of work, aside from obviously just the enormous scope of it, is the materials, because obviously so much was not preserved by Jewish women. And so you do have to be very creative and kind of be like an investigator. It's a kind of, I always feel like being a historian is sort of like being a detective. You have to figure out where might something be hidden, and how do you uncover that voice, and how do you make it come alive? So I, as a reader, I didn't look carefully enough at the footnotes, I guess, to realize that you didn't have documents from Caroline herself. Her voice definitely came through. So you did a fabulous job of that. So I know you talked about kind of coming to this project actually through the familial lens and thinking about the family photos and clothing, and sort of how the outsides of women's lives had changed. But I'm curious also, as a historian, how are you thinking about what needed to be told in terms of how to share this kind of broad story? How are you thinking about this book as being, giving us a different lens onto Jewish women's history than what we've had access to before? Because this really is quite new.
Right, thanks. This was a project that I've worked on for decades. I've thought about writing this book since before the Jewish Women's Archive was founded, and I was privileged to be part of one of the founding conferences. I wanted to tell a story that would resonate broadly, and I made a very conscious decision. I didn't write this as an academic book, but the footnotes are there. I felt that we needed to have this story told in an accessible format that could reach really broadly. And I'll tell you part of the reason, what inspired me to do that. Many years ago, my department of history at American University was hiring a US women's historian. We came kind of late to this. It was the 1990s. We thought that it was about time that we finally hired a women's historian. And we didn't have very many women in the department back then. And we went around interviewing and inviting to campus some of the really big names in the field at that moment in time. Back then I was working on the book that became Women Who Would Be Rabbis. And I knew in the back of my mind that one day I wanted to try to write a big history of America's Jewish women. And I went up to one of them one day and I said, this is what I'm working on. This is what I'm thinking about. I was a really young assistant professor. And she turned to me and I said, I'm going to write the history of America's Jewish women. She said, there's no such thing. And I knew that she was Jewish. And I also knew that in some of her multicultural work that she had been ignoring Jewish women at that point. And so as I thought about writing this book, part of it is an answer to her, that it's possible to do that if you look carefully at the complexity of Jewish women, but you understand kind of that spark of Jewishness that still affects them, even those who deny it, it would be possible to achieve it. But the other reason I could write this book now is it's sitting on more than a quarter of a century of scholarship in women's history and in Jewish women's history. And as I've told you before, I could not have written this without the work of the Jewish Women's Archive. The Women's Archive has been an extraordinary resource that enabled me to double check what I was thinking about, but also to pull out snippets of particular stories that maybe I wouldn't have found. So I'm very, very grateful to the Jewish Women's Archive.
Thank you. And we're so grateful that you were able to make this, some of our resources into this story and bring it to a new audience. So, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading this is just where the commonalities are across the centuries and where the differences are. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, since you hold all of this in your mind, sort of what have been some of the concerns or experiences of American Jewish women that have been relatively constant across the centuries? Because you're covering such a wide swath. And as you say, their lives change in so many ways, from, birth rates to life expectancy to education. There's so many things that change, but where would you see the kind of through lines?
I see a number of through lines. Obviously, one is deep commitment to family to community, to neighborhood. That is really in many ways quite striking, and also this tremendous sense of activism. In every section of the book, even in when I'm writing about Rebecca Gratz in the early 19th century, I'm seeing Jewish women appropriate to their time and place, trying to improve the world about them. And of course it takes different forms in the 21st century, but as a thread that ran all across the book. And then the other big thread that I think runs all across the book is this powerful sense of self. That Jewish women, and I'm not saying other women don't have this, but Jewish women take that very strong sense of self that they've honed growing up in their families, and then in the families that they create when they marry, and they're transmitting that onto the next generations. And I see that even in some of the work that you do, like with the Rising Voices Fellowship, this really conscious effort to take what we know from the past and then move it forward, kind of today we would say pay it forward to the next generation.
Yeah, it's been wonderful actually for us with our work with young people. I think often there's a kind of a assumption that young people aren't interested in what came before, but we find that actually at all. Like the young people that we work with, they want to know, they don't want to reinvent the past. They don't want to reinvent the wheel. They want to know what they're inheriting, what there is to build on. And often it's connected to family. Often it's connected to their community, the other people that they've encountered along the way, teachers and friends mothers. And we love being able to give them the opportunity to delve into that, both in terms of history and also in terms of collecting stories from their own communities, and then adding their voices back to it, which is the great part, to see how they take it and make change out of it. What were some of the big changes were there places where you felt like there were, beyond just sort of the changes of modernity, but were there places where you felt like there were breaks? Like, where do you think some of the women in your book, in the early years of your book, might come back and be shocked or not recognize the Jewish women of today?
Right. Obviously they would be tremendously shocked over the way in which Jewish women have advanced in America. I mean, they'd be shocked to see women on the Supreme Court, in the halls of Congress, in positions of power in the corporate world. I mean, that's an extraordinary change, and that's a change that happened for all of American women. I think some of the early figures that I think about, if I think about like Rebecca Gratz or Pnina Moise, the poet from Charleston, South Carolina, they would be stunned to see women rabbis, and to see women rabbis and to see American Jewish women wearing tallit and tefillin and head coverings. That never was part of the world that they would have thought about. I think Rosa Sonnenschein would also be really shocked by that change. I don't think she would have been so unhappy. She was pretty much of a maverick as far as I can tell. But that kind of change in the Jewish world would be really astounding to them.
There's some of them who kind of set some of the seeds in place, maybe, even if they wouldn't have imagined it kind of playing out the way it does now. I liked seeing the places in the story where you point out where women had raised this question of studying or rabbinate before it actually became part of what was actually changing in the training of rabbis. It was interesting to see. You talk so much in the book about Jewish women's involvement in activism and social justice, and that, the ways in which Jewish women have been at the forefront of so many movements throughout American history. And I think that's something we're thinking a lot about now in this moment in 2019, about what Jewish women's roles are in the social justice movements of the 21st century. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, sort of where you see that particular piece of Jewish women's experience and Jewish women's contributions to American society going.
I certainly see it continuing. I understand the complexities and some of the challenges of Jewish women's roles at this particular moment in the women's movement. That was why, although I finished this book over a year ago, not quite a year ago, the manuscript was due on May 10th, I did write about the anti-Semitism of the women's movement that was on display at the various United Nations international conferences between 1975 and 1985. So I know that tensions around Jewish women are not new in terms of the women's movement. And I think that's actually an important contribution. But one of the things that I've been finding astounding as I've been going around and speaking about the book is every time I talk, somebody in the audience comes up and talks about her grandmother or her mother, or a story she knew about her great-grandmother who was a major activist, did something, whether it was campaigning for suffrage, it was boycotting meat, it was fighting for renters' rights. And then often they will tell me about what they've done. That's something that they have recently done. Somebody was telling me that some developer wanted to start explosions. He needed to blow through rock in her neighborhood, and she got him to stop. And I'm seeing, as they're telling me these stories, I'm seeing them writing the next chapter of Jewish women's activism.
That's exciting.
Yeah,
it's a great part of being on tour, I guess. You get to witness the unfolding of history in our own time. So on that note, sort of as you were writing this, I know that when you're embarking on something so enormous, it gives you a particular lens into what is already out, what's been written about and what hasn't been. And I'm wondering if you sort of uncovered certain topics that you thought, oh, there's more here, like this is that you might want to write, or something that you just think deserves more attention. Where are the pockets of potential Jewish women's history for us to write going forward?
I think there's so many different places. It's really astonishing. I as a historian, you can read my book and you will know where every single sentence came from, even without having to look at the footnotes, and each one of those topics could be a spin-off to a future book. What I found when I was working on this that I did that was very different, I think, than what anybody had done in the past in terms of trying to synthesize the history of America's Jewish women, is I wrote 2 parallel chapters. I have a chapter called The American Jewess about the well-to-do Central European Jewish women, either daughters of immigrants, some of them were immigrants themselves, who had kind of made it in America between 1880 and 1920. And then I have that parallel chapter about the East European immigrants. And I see them as running on 2 separate trajectories. And no one, I don't think, has ever kind of looked at them in that particular light, that they're here at the very same moment in time, but they have totally different paths. And then they don't converge until the gates begin to shut in the 1920s. And then at the 1930s, we finally get to half of America's Jews being native born. So there's a changing pattern. But I think somebody could do much more with that theme as well. Mm-hmm. I think there are just so many places. And I'm especially well aware that in terms of Jewish women's contributions to American culture, that so much more could be done. That mm-hmm. I should confess, the original manuscript was twice as long. And I was told that if I wanted to reach a wider audience, I needed to cut. So I cut a lot. There's a lot on my floor that I could probably pull together and publish again.
So what did you cut? I'm so curious.
Part of it was a stylistic decision. As a historian, typically if I want to make a point, I have at least 3 examples to prove that I'm right. I cut 2 out of every 3 examples. And I'm comfortable doing it because I know that I had the examples so that they're back there. I cut a lot on Jewish women in American culture. Mm-hmm. It was impossible as I worked on that. I mean, I do have Molly Goldberg, and I do have a little bit on Barbara Streisand, and I do have Anita Diamond in the Red Tent, and I mentioned Grace Paley, but Cynthia Ozick was in an earlier version, didn't make it into this version. There's Jewish women have made such enormous contributions to American culture that either I just kind of scantily treated it, or I was going to be told of everything that I had left out. So that was a very conscious and difficult decision. That was a really tough decision.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great invitation to other scholars to pick up that work and continue to tell those stories. And I think that this book does a great job of inviting us into that, piquing the interest of people with so many different characters and so many different directions that you managed to pull together so elegantly. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
I know we want to leave some time for participants to ask questions. And if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask, you can, as Larissa said, type them in the chat box, which you should see if you scroll over the bottom of your screen.
Maybe as, by the way, hi everyone, I'm back, just in a slightly different setting. So I just thought I would take this moment, maybe while people are thinking about questions, just to thank Pamela for her talk, and also just the wonderful conversation between you and Judith. I imagine you gave everyone a lot to think about, and I imagine everyone is thinking super hard right now about a great question that they want to ask you.
I can ask another question while we wait for people to type their questions in. You know, I was struck by what you said about, you know, the kind of lack of attention that's sometimes given to Jewish women's history, or the sense that there is, you know, that there is a history of Jewish women. And sometimes I think that happens, as you're saying, that, you know, that people don't name historical actors as Jews, so people kind of miss the fact that there's a Jewish story there. And then also that, you know, sometimes people think about Jewish women's impact only in the context of the Jewish community. So I was wondering if you know, you talk about so many different aspects of American history, but, you know, where would you kind of note Jewish women's impact on American history specifically?
It's enormous. I mean, Jewish women's impact on American history stands out in so many different places. I understand what you're saying. It's easier to write about Jewish women when you write about them in the synagogue or their Jewish women's organizations, because it's a kind of internal history. And to get at their dispersionist history, their broader history of how they impacted America is very tough. I mean, as we all know from Joyce Antler's marvelous new book about radical Jewish women, that Jewish women were disproportionately represented in the feminist movement and changed America, left a legacy of changing America. And they did that, I would argue, they did that partly coming out of their particular Jewish identities. And Betty Friedan has written about this, that she grew up experiencing anti-Semitism, understanding what it was like to be an outsider, and that opened her eyes to what it was like for women to be outsiders. There are just enormous places in American life where we see this, but that's like one of the very obvious ones.
Great.
So we do have a few questions that have come in, so I'll just kind of start from the top. So Erica said, great question about the pockets that remain to be explored, and a related question, any thoughts as to why Emma Lazarus is so much better known than Rosa Sonnenschein?
Emma Lazarus is so much better known than Rosa Sonnenschein because Emma Lazarus was in conversation with the leading intellectual figures of her day, and Rosa Sonnenschein, I mean, this actually kind of gets back to Judith's question of a minute ago. Rosa Sonnenschein was really stayed within the Jewish world, didn't have any kind of publishing career beyond the Jewish world. She published in Jewish newspapers before she created the American Jewess, and afterwards she also wrote about Jewish issues in some other Jewish settings. But Emma Lazarus left a legacy, and also you have to remember, Emma Lazarus was a wonderful poet, and after her death, her sister gathered her poetry and published a book of that poetry, and of course she won the competition that ultimately, long after her death, placed the new Colossus in the Statue of Liberty. So I think Americans today don't know a whole lot about poetry, but if they do, they might know the name of Emma Lazarus.
I'll also say, just this isn't an answer to the question, but Rosa Sonnenschein is one of my favorites, and not only because JWA digitized the American Jewess, although I do recommend spending some time browsing through its pages, because what's so astounding about it is just how broadly she wrote and thought, and how much she put into the conversation, like how much she kind of put on the table as things that American Jewish women should talk about. Everything from, should women be allowed to ride bicycles, which was a very controversial topic at the time, to Zionism. I mean, you talk in the book about how she was talking about Zionism, you know, basically as Herzl was coming up with the term, right? You know, like there's really a sense that Jewish women should be part of every conversation and had a lot to contribute to all those conversations. So it's quite powerful.
And you know, she met Herzl because she would travel back to Europe to visit her family. And so she met Herzl, and she became a Zionist, I think, before just about any American Jew became a Zionist.
Mm-hmm.
So we also have a question from Jenny. She says, Pam, I loved your story about Caroline Spiegel and finding her voice through her husband's letters. Could you tell us a little more about some of the methodological challenges of writing this book and some of the other creative ways you got around them?
The largest methodological challenge was the amount of material. I mean, not so much in the earlier period, but in the later period. One of the things that I did, which I borrowed from Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who wrote Martha Ballard's diary, is when I was trying to write about the colonial women, where I didn't have their voices, I had inventories of objects that had been left in their homes when they died. And I tried to read into their lives through those objects. I think historians appreciate that. I'm not sure that a wider audience understands that that's an acceptable historical methodology. But then as I moved beyond, especially once I got to the second half of the 19th century and going forward, there's just an enormous amount of material. And then how do you sift through it? How do you choose it? One summer, I was chairing my history department, so I didn't have a lot of time to do my own work. But one summer, I sat in preparation to write this book, and I made a 35-page single-spaced outline. I went through my folders, I went through the books that were on my shelves, and I kind of figured where I would plug various things in. And for me, the biggest methodological challenge was feeling overwhelmed by the project. I felt really overwhelmed by it for a long time. And then after I got that outline down, then I started writing, like I would say like half a page here, 2 pages there. I've mostly ignored that because as I wrote that, that's why the first draft was twice as long.
Yeah.
So our next question is from Rivi, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who says, I'm curious about Orthodox women. What did you find? What's left to learn? Do they have a particular challenge in making their way?
Definitely, yes. Definitely there is a lot left to learn. And we need to know actually much more about their history. Right now, there's a lot of literature that's been coming out. We call it the off-the-derrick literature, the OTD literature. And so that's given us a kind of very weird insight into the Orthodox world because we're reading about the Orthodox world through the lens of people who have left it. I write about Orthodoxy, especially in the last chapter, where I'm trying to get into the worldview of the women who stayed within the Orthodox world. And Orthodoxy has also changed tremendously over time in America. What it is today is very different than it was in an earlier period. But in this book, because of the length, I don't give enough attention to any of the religious streams of American Judaism. So that might be another direction that somebody would go in.
Okay, so we have a question from Alyssa. I'm going to kind of paraphrase the beginning part, but Alyssa says she's writing a novel based on, I'm writing a novel based on my family's immigration story from the Russian Pale to New York in the late 19th century and through the lenses of my grandmothers. I think my Jewish grandmothers are most of the reason I'm here today. I'm curious to learn more about the role Jewish women played in shaping their families' journeys from the Pale to the US. Can you speak to that?
I can definitely speak to that. I assume that you might have discovered the work of Mary Antin, an early 20th century writer, actually published her first book in 1899, where she writes specifically about the journey to America. Jewish women played a powerful role in that journey to America because very often their husbands came first to save up enough money to buy ship's tickets to send home. And then it would be the mother who would have to would have to shepherd the family from essentially the shtetl or the city that they were coming from, and then coming across to America. And so we have a really good window into Jewish women's experience doing that, and also not quite as powerful window, but it's there, of the perils of Jewish women traveling on their own from shtetl to America.
Judith, did you want to add anything, or should I go on to the next question?
Go ahead.
Okay, great. So our next question comes from Yael. She says, curious to know what common threads from our past, if any, you see expressed in young American Jewish women today. The women of this generation are, generally speaking, more culturally diverse, less traditional in Jewish practice, and more affluent than most of their ancestors. Do you think anything unites them today?
I would say that what unites Jewish women today is in many ways what continued to unite them in the past, and that is that component of Jewishness that continues to affect their identities. And I agree, they're much more diverse than they've ever been. The American Jewish community is very different today than it was in even 25 years ago, but that Jewishness still continues to define the vast majority of American Jews. And of course, we're also at this moment where we are facing something that we never thought we would be facing again in American life, and that is anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism, historians know, has a paradoxical effect. Sometimes anti-Semitism strengthens Jewish identity in very difficult times. So I think that's what I would say unites the next generations of Jewish women of today.
So those were all of the questions. I don't know if anyone has any further questions. We can also go ahead and wrap up. I also just wanted to give a last chance if you, Pamela or Judith, wanted to say anything by way of closing. If not, I can go ahead and wrap us up.
Well, I would just like to say my thanks to the Jewish Women's Archive for the opportunity, and also to urge everyone who watches this or who is on now to use some of the resources there, because they really are extraordinary. So thank you for your work.
And thank you so much for writing this book and for sharing it with us. It's a tremendous, tremendous resource and quite an accomplishment. I can imagine, I can only begin to imagine how overwhelmed you were in trying to put all of this together, but you've done a great job.
Thank you both so much. Thank you to everyone who attended today. As I said at the beginning, the recording will be online and made available. I'm sure we'll send it out to everyone who is here, and we hope to see you all at another JWA event soon. Thank you.